In Georgia, 1821, a patch of untamed swampland transformed into a thriving slave farm in just 2 days, built not by overseer orders, but by the minds of people the world called property. The official story credits white planters with Southern agriculture's rise, yet auction records reveal slave traders paid extra for men like Kofi, snatched from the Gold Coast for secrets in his hands, engineering earthworks, training water to obey, turning jungle to rice. Their captors boasted of conquest, but never grasped the science unfolding at their feet. What happens when forced labor becomes a network of hidden expertise? In this story, survival and resistance are grown in silence, and what you think a slave farm means is about to be rewritten. Kofi stepped onto the Georgia coast as the sun pressed down, the air thick with salt and the stink of low tide. Chains bit into his wrists, still raw from the journey, each step sinking into mud that clung to his bare feet. He could taste iron and brine with every breath. Around him, men and women stumbled off the boat, some coughing, some silent, all marked by weeks in the hold. Bodies thinned, eyes hollow, the language of home already slipping from their tongues. Auctioneers barked over the crowd, their voices sharp, listing ages, teeth, scars, as if reading off livestock. Buyers leaned in, prodding arms, peering into mouths, searching for signs of strength or skill. No one asked for names. The slave yard itself was a patch of trampled sand at the edge of the swamp, ringed by cypress trees and thick with mosquitoes. Kofi's wrists were unshackled long enough for a closer inspection. A planter named Whitmore circled him, hands behind his back, boots caked in dried mud, eyes cold and calculating. Whitmore's overseer grunted approval at Kofi's broad shoulders and calloused palms. A nod, a number, and Kofi was claimed, his fate decided in less than a minute. The price Whitmore paid was higher than for most, but not for Kofi's body alone. Whitmore had been told this new arrival came from the Gold Coast, that he knew how to make water move and earth hold firm. That was the rumor among the traders, but in Whitmore's mind, Kofi was just another tool for the land. The group of newly purchased slaves was marched inland, the chain gang winding through sawgrass and mud flats. The land here was nothing like the fields of Kofi's childhood. This was a world of tangled roots, sharp reeds, and water that never stayed still. Everywhere, the threat of snakes, biting flies, and the silent hunger that waited if the ground refused to yield. The plantation itself was barely more than a clearing, no cabins yet, only a few rough sheds, piles of timber, and a field of stumps where the forest had been hacked away. The air buzzed with the sound of axes and the shouts of overseers, the work already begun before the last slave had arrived. On that first day, Kofi saw what the land demanded. The swamp was both prison and promise, rich black mud that could feed 100 mouths, but only if tamed. The overseers barked orders in English, but the real language of survival ran silent between the enslaved. Glances, gestures, the quick sharing of what little they knew, where the ground was driest, which roots could be eaten, how to move without twisting an ankle in the sucking mud. Every mistake could mean a beating, or worse. But every small act of care was a thread in an invisible net, binding the new arrivals to one another. By nightfall, Kofi's arms ached from swinging an axe. His back burned from sun and whip. He watched the sky darken over the marsh and listened to the frogs start their chorus. The land seemed endless, the work impossible. But beneath the surface, something else was taking root. A quiet understanding, a flicker of memory from across the ocean, and the first hint that knowledge, even in chains, could be shared and multiplied. The swamp would not give up its secrets easily. but neither would Kofi. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, hands sunk wrist-deep in the wet soil, feeling for the subtle give that signaled the right patch for rice. Her grandmother had taught her this trick back in Sierra Leone: how to read the earth's softness, how to judge the water's slow rise. Whitmore's men watched for strong backs, but never noticed the quiet conversations that happened over the rows, or the way Sarah's eyes lingered on the lay of the land longer than anyone else. By dusk, she had already mapped out in her head where the water would want to pool, where it would run off, and where the ground would hold a crop through a dry spell. Not far off, Marcus paused to rub his palms together, eyes tracing the scattered stumps and wild cane that marked the borders of the new field. He had grown up on the edge of the Senegal River, where every planting season meant a new gamble with the land. He knew which plants thrived side by side, how millet shielded beans from the wind, how a patch of cassava could keep the soil rich for the next year's corn. Here, the tools were crude and the work relentless, but Marcus recognized the same patterns in the Georgia mud. He caught Sarah's glance and nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. The overseers barked orders in English, but the real work of planning happened in the soft exchanges that slipped beneath their notice. In stolen moments, at the water barrel, in the shadows of the shed, during the hush before dawn, Sarah and Marcus traded knowledge in fragments of Mende, Wolof, and broken English. They spoke of river tides, of seed soaking, of the right time to turn the soil. Kofi listened, adding what he remembered of terracing from the Gold Coast, and soon others joined in, each bringing a piece of the puzzle. How to spot the first signs of blight, how to build a mound that would drain just enough, how to save a handful of seeds for the next season. The group grew bolder as they realized the value of what they carried. Whitmore had paid a premium for Kofi, but he didn't know that Sarah's hands could coax rice from mud where others failed, or that Marcus could double a yield by pairing crops no overseer had ever heard of. At the markets in Savannah and Charleston, rumors spread of planters bidding higher for captives from the Rice Coast, not for brute strength, but for the secrets passed down through generations. Traders listed skills in their ledgers, and buyers paid more for those who could name the right seed or build a watergate from nothing but cypress and rope. By the second night, the outlines of an invisible network had begun to form. Knowledge moved quietly, from hand to hand, across lines of tribe and language. Each person brought something the others needed. In the darkness, as the fire burned low and the sound of frogs drifted over the fields, they shared more than stories. They shared the means to survive, and maybe, in time, to shape the land on their own terms. Axes hit the trunks of cypress and gum, each swing splintering wood that had stood for centuries. The air filled with the sound of iron on bark and the dull thud of roots torn from wet earth. Kofi moved with the rhythm of the work, guiding others to fell the largest trees first, knowing that the stumps would form the backbone of the dikes. Every log dragged from the muck meant another section of marsh claimed for planting. The land here was flat, but the tides ruled everything, rising and falling nearly 18 inches twice a day, flooding the low ground with brackish water. Sarah marked the edges of the new field with a sharpened stick, her eyes tracing the high water line left by the last tide. She called out to Marcus, who joined her in measuring the slope with nothing more than a length of knotted cord and a practiced eye. They calculated the drop from riverbank to field, careful not to let the water pool too deep or drain too fast. The goal was simple: create a grid of level beds, each bordered by a raised bank, each able to hold water at just the right depth. 8-foot trees were felled and split into rough planks, then hammered together to form the trunks, wooden sluice gates set deep in the embankments. These trunks became the heartbeat of the farm, opening and closing with the tides to let water in or keep it out. The overseer shouted for speed, but the real pace was set by the land itself. Kofi taught the others how to pack the clay tight along the banks, stomping it down until the dike held firm against the push of the river. Sarah and a handful of women shaped the first canals, digging narrow channels from the main trunk into each field. They worked barefoot, mud up to their knees, using short-handled hoes and baskets woven from marsh grass to haul the earth away. The work was brutal, backs bent, hands blistered, bodies exposed to biting flies and the ever-present threat of snakebite. Every mistake, a weak spot in a dike, a misaligned trunk, meant disaster when the next tide came in. By the second night, the outlines of the new farm could be seen from the river, a patchwork of rectangular fields, each ringed by embankments, each connected by a web of shallow canals. The land had shifted from wild marsh to something ordered and controlled, but the price was paid in sweat, blood, and the lives of those forced to build it. Kofi and Sarah kept watch as the tide rolled in, checking the banks for leaks, adjusting the trunks to balance the water. The fields would be ready for planting soon, but the labor of turning swamp to farmland had already claimed its due. The plantation owner would see only the neat lines and rising banks, never the calculations, the knowledge, or the cost carved into every foot of earth. By the time the fields were carved from the marsh, another kind of labor began in the shadows. When the overseer's shouts faded and the last light slipped behind the cypress, small groups drifted toward the narrow strips of earth behind the cabins. These plots, barely more than a few paces wide, became the ground where survival and memory tangled together. Here, Kofi knelt in the loose earth, fingers pressing seeds deep into the soil. Some of these seeds had crossed the Atlantic hidden in braids or tucked into hems, tiny stowaways from the Gold Coast and Sierra Leone. Bene, okra, black-eyed peas, each one a living thread tying the present to a place left behind. Sarah moved along the rows, humming a tune her grandmother once sang at planting time. The melody carried the rhythm of work, but it also held instructions: when to sow, how to space the hills, which plants kept the soil sweet. She showed the youngest children how to pinch the tips from sweet potato vines and set them in water jars. Marcus, careful with every handful of seed, planted cowpeas beside the corn to fix the soil and tucked okra between the rows to shade the roots. These weren't just crops for the table, they were a quiet map of everything they'd carried from home. The night gardens grew in patterns that made sense only to those who worked them. Beans curled around the stalks of maize, bene sprouted at the corners to keep away insects, and bitter greens filled the gaps where nothing else would grow. Some plants healed as well as fed: yarrow for fever, garlic for wounds, mint to soothe a cough. The gardens became a kind of ledger, recording what could be spared from each day's ration and what might be traded or shared when times grew lean. Work in these plots happened after the day's labor was done, by moonlight, by memory, by the soft call of voices that slipped between cabins. Songs rose and fell over the rows, carrying instructions and warnings, stories of harvests lost and saved. Elders taught the youngest how to mark the seasons by the moon's shape or the feel of the wind. Knowledge passed hand to hand, never written but always remembered, even as names and places faded in the dark. In these gardens, the enslaved shaped a world that belonged to them, however small. Each seed kept alive was a quiet defiance, a promise that something of the old life would survive beneath the new. The overseer saw only weeds and work, but in the hush of the night, the earth gave back more than food. It returned a sense of self, a memory of freedom, and a way to endure. The taste of bene on the tongue, the green of new okra pods, the steady hum of a planting song, these were roots that ran deeper than any furrow, binding the living to those who had come before and those yet to come. Harvests on Whitmore's land brought in numbers that made the ledgers shine, 26% profit margins year after year. The rice and corn moved downriver by the ton, feeding the markets in Savannah and Charleston. Whitmore, flush with cash, boasted of expanding his holdings, buying up more swamp to clear, more hands to work it. Each new acre meant more bodies pressed into the fields, more nights spent in the mud. But as the farm's success grew, so did the iron grip of control. The memory of Nat Turner's revolt traveled fast, spurring lawmakers in Georgia to rewrite the codes. Patrols doubled along the riverbanks, armed men riding the perimeters, their orders clear. No gatherings after dark, no travel without a pass, no whisper of freedom. The slave codes tightened like a noose, curfews, bans on reading, harsher penalties for any sign of resistance. Whitmore strutted through the rows, convinced that profit was proof of his own genius, blind to the knowledge at work beneath his feet. For the enslaved, every gain for the master meant another layer of surveillance, another law to sidestep. The fields grew richer, but life grew narrower. Still, behind the walls of the cabins, the network of shared wisdom held. Kofi and Sarah watched the expansion and the new patrols, reading the signs in the overseer's tempers and the sudden scarcity of time alone. They knew that in a world where success only sharpened the chains, survival demanded more than just skill. It required vigilance and a quiet, stubborn hope that the land could be made to serve more than one master. A gray film crept across the rice fields, clinging to every blade. By dawn, the youngest had spotted it first, patches of black rot spreading fast, stalks collapsing in clumps. The overseer cursed at the sight, but it was Sarah who recognized the blight. She had seen it before, back in Sierra Leone, and knew what would come next if nothing was done. Whole fields wiped out, rations cut, punishments handed down for each bushel lost. Whitmore raged up and down the rows, demanding answers, but his threats meant nothing to the fungus eating through his profits. Kofi called Marcus and Sarah aside, voices low, hands moving quick. Marcus slipped away at dusk and returned with armfuls of wild garlic and bitter yam, roots his grandmother once used to keep rot from millet. Sarah gathered ash from the night's fire and mixed it with the crushed bulbs, working the paste into the water at the edge of each patty. They moved in silence, spreading the mixture by hand, marking each section with a twist of grass so the others would know where to tend next. Kofi poured the last of the mixture into the main channel, letting the current carry it through the fields. By the third morning, the rot had stopped. New shoots pushed up through the mud, green and strong. The overseer credited the change to luck, but the enslaved knew better. They had seen their remedy work before, and now it had saved the harvest. Whitmore never learned how close he had come to losing everything. The fields would yield as planned, and the ledgers would show another year of profit. But in the cabins that night, Kofi, Sarah, and Marcus sat together, sharing a meal of fresh greens, knowing that their knowledge, carried across an ocean, hidden in memory and song, had turned disaster aside. For a moment, the power in the fields belonged to them. Auction records from 1820s Georgia show that enslaved Africans with specialized agricultural skills were sold at premiums up to 30% above average prices. This documentary has revealed how Kofi, Sarah, and Marcus, rooted in centuries of West African farming science, engineered plantations that their owners could neither design nor sustain alone. Their expertise in terracing, rice irrigation, and crop rotation not only transformed the land, but also preserved African seeds and knowledge under violent oppression. Yet, many plantation records omit the names and methods of those who made this success possible, leaving gaps historians still work to fill. Today, crops like rice, okra, and black-eyed peas remain staples of Southern cuisine, a living legacy of enslaved ingenuity. The fact remains, the prosperity of American plantations depended on African expertise, and the story of this farm shows how survival and resistance were built into every harvest.